The dawn of the 20th century was marked by a flurry of scientific progress, and among the names that helped shape modern communication, Guglielmo Marconi stands out as a transformative figure. Understanding his later achievements in wireless telegraphy requires a careful examination of the environment in which he was raised and the formative experiences that influenced his intellectual development. Marconi was not merely a product of scientific curiosity. He was a man whose upbringing, education, and socio-cultural surroundings converged to create an innovator capable of reshaping the world. Guglielmo Marconi was born on April 25, 1874, in Bologna, Italy, into a family that straddled two worlds: the aristocratic traditions of Italian nobility and the rationalism of the Anglo-Saxon mercantile class. His father, Giuseppe Marconi, was an Italian landowner, while his mother, Annie Jameson, hailed from the Irish Jameson whiskey distilling dynasty. This bicultural heritage exposed Marconi to a blend of conservative European values and British pragmatism, an early duality that would echo throughout his professional endeavors and diplomatic finesse. From a young age, Marconi exhibited a profound fascination with the natural sciences, particularly electricity and magnetism. While he did not attend formal school in his early years, he was tutored at home, which allowed his intellectual interests to flourish outside the rigid constraints of a standardized curriculum. His mother, well-educated and fluent in English, took an active role in nurturing his curiosity and ensured that he was introduced to key scientific ideas and texts at an early stage. The presence of English-language books in his home and frequent travels to Britain played a critical role in broadening his exposure to international scientific thought. As Marconi matured, his education transitioned to more structured forms. He enrolled in the Livorno Technical Institute, where he received foundational instruction in physics and later attended the University of Bologna as a listener rather than a registered student. This unorthodox approach allowed him to study under prominent physicists, including Augusto Righi, whose work on Hertzian waves deeply influenced Marconi's thinking. Righi's mentorship, though informal, introduced Marconi to the world of electromagnetic theory, laying the groundwork for his independent experiments in wireless transmission. Italy at the time was undergoing both political unification and industrial awakening. The intellectual climate was one of ambition and experimentation, yet limited infrastructure and state support for scientific research hindered the pace of technological innovation. Marconi's work would eventually challenge and overcome these limitations, but initially, his ambitions were met with indifference from Italian academic and government circles. This lack of recognition at home would later propel Marconi to seek support abroad, particularly in Britain, where his mother's connections and command of the language proved instrumental. Marconi's early experiments, conducted at his family estate in Pontecchio, near Bologna, reveal much about his methodology and determination. Using basic materials, coils, batteries, and a rudimentary coherer, he began sending wireless signals across his garden, gradually increasing the distance with each attempt. These first trials were notable not just for their technical success, but for their reflection of Marconi's engineering intuition. Unlike some of his contemporaries, who remained in theoretical domains, Marconi was always focused on practical application and real-world utility. The intellectual context of Marconi's formative years also included the aftermath of James Clerk Maxwell's electromagnetic theory and Heinrich Hertz's experimental validation of electromagnetic waves. While Marconi was not a theorist himself, he was astutely aware of these developments. His strength lay in his ability to translate complex scientific principles into functioning systems, a distinction that would define his career. In a period when the gap between science and engineering was significant, Marconi's ability to straddle both worlds gave him a unique advantage. Moreover, Marconi's youth was characterized by a relentless desire to improve and a capacity for long hours of laborious trial and error. Unlike some inventors who stumbled upon their discoveries by accident, Marconi's progress was incremental and disciplined. He maintained detailed notes of his experiments and frequently revised his apparatus based on observed limitations. This scientific rigor, combined with a business-minded approach inherited from his Anglo-Irish heritage, positioned him not only as an inventor, but as a future entrepreneur and industrialist. Another often overlooked but significant factor in Marconi's early development was his family's financial stability. While not fabulously wealthy, the Marconi household had sufficient means to support Guglielmo's experiments and supply the equipment he required. This relative affluence allowed him to pursue scientific work without the immediate pressure of earning a livelihood, an advantage that many contemporaries did not share. It also facilitated travel, which became crucial in the dissemination of his ideas and in securing international backing. The close of the 19th century was a period brimming with scientific tension and curiosity. Invisible forces, electricity, magnetism, and light had begun to reveal their interconnected nature, yet their full potential remained only partially tapped. It was within this context that Guglielmo Marconi began to formulate the idea that would revolutionize communication: the transmission of signals through space without the need for wires. Unlike others who saw electromagnetic waves as a phenomenon to be measured or theorized, Marconi envisioned them as tools, silent messengers that could leap over hills, rivers, and even oceans. The conceptual spark that would ignite Marconi's work did not emerge from a single moment of inspiration, but rather from a gradual accumulation of understanding. He was particularly fascinated by the recent experiments of Heinrich Hertz, who had demonstrated in the late 1880s that electromagnetic waves could be generated and detected. While Hertz saw these waves as mere physical curiosities, Marconi saw in them the skeleton of a new communication system. He was not a physicist attempting to prove a law, but an inventor attempting to realize a function: long-distance, wireless signal transmission. From the quiet hills of Pontecchio, Marconi began to tinker with coils, batteries, and spark gaps, converting his attic into a modest laboratory. It was here, in isolation and without institutional guidance, that he first sought to increase the range of wireless signals. He had read that electromagnetic waves could travel only short distances, mere meters at best, but he was skeptical. Through persistent experimentation, he learned that elevating the antenna and grounding the receiver extended the range considerably. These were not trivial findings. They challenged prevailing assumptions about wave behavior and opened up new engineering possibilities. The use of a vertical antenna was one of Marconi's key insights. Unlike the horizontal detectors used by others, his vertical arrangement allowed for more efficient propagation of radio waves. Though he lacked the mathematical rigor to explain why it worked, he trusted his empirical results. His decision to ground the receiving system was equally important, creating a circuit that better captured the incoming signals. Together, these innovations transformed what had been a lab-bound experiment into a working prototype for real-world communication. At first, Marconi's ambitions were modest. He hoped that wireless telegraphy might prove useful in situations where wires were impractical, such as communication between ships and shore stations. His early test involved transmitting a signal from one end of his garden to the other, marked by the click of a Morse signal. The simplicity of this first success did not betray the underlying complexity of the problem, nor the magnitude of the solution he was about to unleash upon the world. With each success, Marconi pushed further, testing the limits of distance, clarity, and consistency. Marconi's prototype system used a spark gap transmitter to generate radio waves and a coherer, a glass tube filled with metal filings, as a receiver. When a wave reached the coherer, the filings would temporarily align to allow an electric current to pass, signaling the reception of a Morse-coded message. Though rudimentary by modern standards, this device was sufficient to prove the feasibility of the concept. Unlike the theoretical work of his predecessors, Marconi's apparatus was designed to solve a tangible problem, and it was that practicality that would eventually distinguish him in the eyes of both scientists and businessmen. The problem of distance became an obsession. As Marconi's confidence grew, he extended his tests beyond his home, sending signals across fields and over small hills. He began to involve assistants, friends and neighbors who helped carry the increasingly bulky equipment to more remote locations. It was during one of these field trials that he managed to transmit a signal over 2 kilometers, a distance that caught the attention of observers and marked a psychological turning point for Marconi. He now believed that, with the right improvements, signals could travel far beyond the visual horizon. The idea of communication without wires was both thrilling and met with skepticism. Critics dismissed the notion as impractical or even impossible, citing the limited understanding of atmospheric interference and signal decay. Marconi, however, remained undeterred. His approach was grounded not in academic approval, but in mechanical efficacy. He saw each failed attempt as a blueprint for refinement. For Marconi, invention was a dialogue between idea and material, between theory and apparatus, and he listened closely to the lessons taught by failure. Perhaps most significant was the way in which Marconi conceptualized the use of wireless technology, not merely as a scientific novelty, but as a system that could be integrated into society. He imagined its use in military operations, maritime safety, and transcontinental messaging. These visions would later inform his entrepreneurial strategy, but even in the earliest stages, it was clear that Marconi thought in terms of systems, not isolated gadgets. This systems-oriented mindset distinguished him from the many tinkerers of the day, who viewed innovation as a personal or academic pursuit rather than a global infrastructure in waiting. By the end of 1895, Marconi was ready to take his ideas beyond the boundaries of his homeland. The Italian government, having shown limited interest in his inventions, failed to recognize the potential he was offering. Arriving in England in early 1896, Guglielmo Marconi entered a country pulsing with industrial ambition and technical curiosity. The British Empire, with its sprawling naval power and global communication needs, was a fertile ground for innovation. Unlike in Italy, where Marconi had struggled to gain recognition, England offered a more receptive climate. Accompanied by his mother, who acted as both a translator and social bridge, Marconi came armed not with grandiose claims, but with a working device that could transmit signals invisibly through the air, an astonishing concept for most observers. Marconi wasted no time in seeking out allies. With introductions facilitated by his mother's British connections, he soon found himself in contact with William Preece, the chief engineer of the General Post Office. Preece, himself intrigued by electrical transmission and no stranger to public demonstrations, immediately recognized the potential of Marconi's invention. Though cautious at first, he arranged for the young Italian to conduct tests at the post office's experimental facilities. These trials would mark the beginning of Marconi's formal engagement with the British scientific and engineering establishment. The initial experiments were modest in scale, but impressive in result. Using a relatively simple spark gap transmitter and a coherer receiver, Marconi successfully sent signals across a distance of nearly 2 kilometers on Salisbury Plain. The equipment was rudimentary: brass rods as antennas, induction coils for power, and bells to register the Morse code signals. Yet the results were indisputable. Messages were sent and received without wires, passing through physical obstructions and defying the expectations of onlookers. For many, it was their first encounter with what would later be known as radio waves. Encouraged by these early successes, Marconi sought to scale up his experiments. He understood instinctively that in order to secure commercial and governmental interest, he needed to demonstrate wireless communication across distances that were previously considered impractical. To do this, he began to refine his apparatus. Longer antennas were employed, and greater attention was paid to tuning both the transmitter and receiver, even though Marconi had only a rudimentary understanding of resonance. These changes resulted in significant improvements in signal strength and clarity. The demonstrations that followed captured the public's imagination. One particularly notable trial took place across the Bristol Channel, where Marconi transmitted messages from Flatholm Island to Lavernock Point, a distance of over 6 kilometers across open water. This achievement drew widespread attention from newspapers and engineers alike. The transmission not only crossed a body of water, but maintained clarity and consistency despite challenging weather conditions. It proved that wireless telegraphy could be used in maritime contexts, a compelling prospect for a nation that depended heavily on naval superiority. Recognizing the need to protect his invention, Marconi filed his first British patent in June 1896. Titled Improvements in Transmitting Electrical Impulses and Signals and an Apparatus Therefore, it outlined the core elements of his wireless system. Although it did not include detailed theoretical explanations, it described a practical method for transmitting and receiving signals using tuned circuits and elevated antennas. This patent became the cornerstone of his growing enterprise and established him legally as the pioneer of a new technology. With patent in hand and successful demonstrations behind him, Marconi moved to secure financial backing. In 1897, he founded the Wireless Telegraph and Signal Company Limited, headquartered in London. This marked a crucial transition in Marconi's career, from independent inventor to corporate innovator. The company was formed with support from engineers, investors, and former naval officers who saw the potential of wireless technology for military and commercial applications. This institutional structure enabled Marconi to scale his research and develop new equipment with greater efficiency. To maintain momentum, the company conducted a series of high-profile public demonstrations. One such event took place at the Royal Needles Hotel on the Isle of Wight, where Marconi succeeded in sending wireless signals over 14 kilometers to the mainland. British royalty, government officials, and military representatives attended these events, lending both prestige and credibility to Marconi's work. The clear, audible signals that emerged from the receiving apparatus were not just scientific novelties. They were symbols of a coming transformation in how the world communicated. Marconi also began working on increasing the reliability and selectivity of wireless signals. A growing concern among observers was the risk of interference, especially as multiple transmitters came into operation. To address this, Marconi began to explore methods of tuning, or syntony, using inductance and capacitance adjustments to create resonance between transmitter and receiver. Though his understanding of the physics was incomplete, he was able to make substantial progress through experimentation, further strengthening the commercial viability of his technology. By the end of 1897, Marconi had established a working wireless communication system that had already begun to attract international attention. He was invited to conduct tests in France and across Europe, and he opened the first permanent wireless station at Needles, on the southern coast of England. What had begun as a solitary series of experiments in the attic of an Italian estate had evolved into a functioning, scalable system of communication that promised to eliminate one of the great limitations of the 19th century: the need for physical wires. For Marconi, the message had finally left the wires, and the world was listening. By 1898, Guglielmo Marconi had already proven that wireless telegraphy was more than an experimental novelty. What he needed next was international validation. To convince the global scientific community and potential clients of his system's reliability and range, he turned to one of the most symbolic and strategic feats he could attempt: sending a wireless signal across the English Channel. The Channel, a natural divide between Britain and mainland Europe, had long represented not only a geographic boundary, but also a technological and political one. Marconi's goal was clear: bridge it invisibly, with waves traveling through the air. The idea of transmitting a wireless signal between Dover in England and Wimereux in France quickly gained interest from both British and French authorities. The channel was roughly 50 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, a challenging distance that far exceeded anything Marconi had previously attempted. It was not just a matter of distance. The signal would have to contend with weather conditions, shifting atmospheres, and coastal interference. But for Marconi, the risks were worth the potential rewards. Success would mean a demonstration not only of scientific achievement, but also of geopolitical significance. Preparations for the attempt began in earnest. Tall masts were erected on both shores, and the equipment was upgraded to maximize transmission strength. The transmitting station at Dover used an improved spark gap system powered by a high-voltage induction coil, while the receiving station in Wimereux employed a carefully tuned coherer system, protected from environmental variables. Every detail was scrutinized: antenna height, signal frequency, and even the timing of the test, all to ensure the highest chance of success. On March 27, 1899, the first successful wireless transmission across the English Channel was received. The signal was clear, undeniable, and historic. For the first time, a message had leapt from one nation to another without any physical medium connecting them. Marconi had shattered another barrier, and the feat was immediately heralded in newspapers across Europe. Scientists who had once dismissed the young Italian now took notice. Political leaders recognized the implications. In war, diplomacy, and commerce, messages could now travel faster than ever, unhindered by sabotage, severed cables, or difficult terrain. The channel transmission was not merely a scientific milestone, but a catalyst for expansion. Following the success, Marconi was invited to demonstrate his technology at several high-level gatherings across the continent. In France, he was welcomed by engineering societies and naval officials eager to explore the military potential of wireless telegraphy. Germany, Italy, and even Russia expressed interest. Marconi found himself in a new role, not just as an inventor, but as an international envoy of wireless communication, demonstrating the universality of electromagnetic waves. Perhaps nowhere was the reaction more enthusiastic than in the maritime world. Shipping companies and navies recognized that wireless communication could transform operations at sea. The ability to send messages without relying on undersea cables or line-of-sight visual signals opened up a new era in navigation and safety. Marconi was quick to seize the opportunity. He offered to outfit vessels with wireless stations and began working with shipbuilders to install compact transmitters and receivers aboard commercial and military fleets. As demand grew, so did the need for more infrastructure. Marconi's company began establishing coastal wireless stations in key ports and along major shipping lanes. These stations could receive and relay messages from vessels at sea, ensuring a continuous line of communication between ship and shore. In less than a year, Marconi had laid the groundwork for a rudimentary wireless network, something that had never before existed. For seafarers, this meant fewer risks and faster updates on weather, navigation, and emergencies. The success also required Marconi to adapt his leadership style. He was no longer working alone or with a small team of assistants. Engineers, technicians, and investors now looked to him for direction. His headquarters in London became a hub of activity, with teams constantly improving equipment, conducting tests, and training operators. Marconi took a hands-on role in every aspect of the business, from design specifications to diplomatic negotiations. Despite his youth, he demonstrated a calm authority that won him the respect of both financiers and governments. Meanwhile, the scientific community remained divided. While many praised his accomplishments, others criticized his lack of theoretical grounding. Marconi was aware of this skepticism, particularly from academic physicists who viewed his work as empirical tinkering rather than disciplined science. But he remained focused on application. For him, utility was the ultimate validation. Every successful transmission was an answer to his critics, each message sent without wires a challenge to their theories. Marconi's belief in the power of demonstration over debate was central to his philosophy of innovation. At the dawn of the 20th century, the world was steadily shrinking. The telegraph and the telephone had already rewired the world's sense of distance. But even these relied on an intricate web of physical cables buried under land and sea. Guglielmo Marconi, now a figure of international stature, had a bold new objective in mind: to send a wireless signal across the vast and unpredictable Atlantic Ocean. No undersea cable, no physical line, just air, waves, and the power of innovation. It would be a daring attempt that many believed impossible, given the prevailing scientific belief that radio waves traveled in straight lines and would simply vanish over the curvature of the Earth. Marconi was undeterred by theoretical doubts. He had already proven that practical experimentation could surpass accepted wisdom, and he believed that atmospheric conditions, particularly at certain frequencies and times of day, might allow radio waves to follow the Earth's curvature or reflect off unknown layers in the atmosphere. His objective was not purely technical, it was symbolic. A successful transmission between continents would demonstrate the limitless reach of wireless communication and position his company at the forefront of a new global infrastructure. To prepare for the transatlantic experiment, Marconi oversaw the construction of a massive transmitting station at Poldhu, a coastal village in Cornwall, England. The station featured a powerful 25-kilowatt transmitter and a fan-shaped antenna system supported by 20 towering masts, each over 60 meters high. The setup represented the most powerful and ambitious wireless station the world had yet seen. Months were spent testing and calibrating the equipment to ensure it could generate a signal powerful enough to cross an ocean, more than 3,000 kilometers of water. Marconi's destination for receiving the signal would be St. John's, Newfoundland, on the eastern edge of Canada. He chose the site for its proximity to Europe and because it offered high cliffs with a clear exposure to the Atlantic. There, in a makeshift receiving station, a small, windswept building on Signal Hill, Marconi and his assistants prepared their fragile instruments. The receiving apparatus was minimal: a kite-lofted aerial wire, a coherer receiver, and a Morse register. The team battled fierce coastal winds and freezing temperatures to hoist the antenna and keep it in place long enough for the experiment. On December 12, 1901, with snow swirling around Signal Hill, Marconi and his team finally heard the faint but unmistakable clicks of Morse code spelling out the letters. It was repeated at regular intervals, 3 dots, transmitted from Poldhu and captured by the coherer in Newfoundland. Though the signal was weak and could not be heard consistently over long durations, it was a breakthrough. A message had leapt across the Atlantic not by ship or cable, but through space, carried invisibly by waves no eye could see. The world had changed in that moment. The news of the transatlantic transmission spread rapidly. Some heralded it as the greatest communications achievement since the telegraph itself. Others were skeptical. Critics questioned the clarity of the message and whether it had been received reliably. Marconi, however, remained composed. He acknowledged the limitations of the test, particularly the inability to transmit over longer periods and during daytime, but defended its validity. It was not yet a functioning service, but it was proof of concept, and for Marconi, that was the first and most important step. The implications were enormous. If wireless signals could cross the Atlantic, they could span the globe. Nations realized that the technology could serve not only ships and armies, but also global news services, financial exchanges, and diplomatic communication. The British government, sensing the strategic advantage, quickly increased its support for Marconi's work. Contracts were signed, funding expanded, and new stations were commissioned on both sides of the Atlantic. It became clear that Marconi's technology was no longer just a scientific curiosity. It was becoming a matter of national importance. In the wake of the transatlantic success, Marconi began constructing permanent wireless stations in Glace Bay, Nova Scotia, and Clifton, Ireland, with the goal of establishing a reliable transoceanic communication link. These stations were even larger and more powerful than the temporary ones used in 1901. Engineers worked tirelessly to improve tuning circuits, increase transmission power, and develop better antennas. By 1907, regular commercial transatlantic wireless service had been established, a development that confirmed the promise of that first faint signal heard on Signal Hill. Marconi's reputation soared. He received invitations to lecture at major universities, was awarded honors by monarchs and presidents, and gained the enthusiastic support of business magnates who saw in him the next step in communication technology. His company grew rapidly, hiring hundreds of technicians and setting up wireless training schools for operators. The Atlantic leap had made him not just a famous inventor, but a builder of a new industry, one that would soon underpin everything from news agencies to maritime safety networks. But perhaps the most profound result of the transatlantic experiment was psychological. It redefined humanity's understanding of distance. No longer was the ocean a barrier to be bridged by cable or ship. It had become a medium, invisible and immediate. Marconi's success marked the end of isolation by geography and the birth of an interconnected world. It was a world still in its infancy, but growing quickly, one signal at a time. Following the success of the transatlantic wireless transmission, Marconi's ambitions took on a more systematic and strategic form. He no longer sought simply to prove that wireless communication was possible. His goal had shifted toward building a permanent, reliable global communication network. To achieve this, he began deploying wireless stations in strategic locations around the world, each serving as a node in a rapidly expanding web of electromagnetic connectivity. This new phase of development demanded not just technical refinement, but careful negotiation with governments, commercial interests, and scientific institutions. One of Marconi's earliest priorities was to ensure that ships at sea could maintain constant communication with land-based stations. To make this feasible, he began installing coastal wireless stations along key maritime corridors. From the British Isles to the Mediterranean, from the east coast of North America to the Indian Ocean, these stations became essential relay points. Their antennas, towering into the skies, were silent sentinels linking vessels to ports and passengers to the safety of the shore. These installations transformed the nature of ocean travel and were particularly valued by shipping companies and navies alike. To support this growing system, Marconi's company began training a cadre of skilled radio operators. These men, often former telegraphers or naval personnel, learned to manage the sensitive equipment, interpret Morse signals, and maintain systems under harsh conditions. Marconi personally emphasized discipline, precision, and loyalty among his operators, seeing them as the backbone of the wireless network. He also introduced standardized procedures for communication, helping to establish early international norms for wireless traffic that would later influence global telecommunications policies. As stations and operators proliferated, Marconi focused on ensuring the interoperability of his systems, while competitors and rival inventors had started to develop their own wireless methods. Many used incompatible equipment or frequencies. To solidify his dominance, Marconi advocated for exclusive use of his patents in state and military communications, a stance that would later spark legal and political disputes. Nonetheless, this approach initially secured his position as the primary architect of long-distance wireless communications. With European colonial powers eager to manage far-flung territories more efficiently, Marconi was called upon to install wireless stations in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. His network extended to places like India, Australia, Egypt, and parts of the Caribbean. These stations made it possible for colonial administrations to exchange messages with the metropole in a matter of minutes instead of weeks. While the implications for administrative control were enormous, Marconi remained focused on the technological and logistical aspects of expansion, avoiding entanglement in the political dimensions of empire. Meanwhile, the business side of Marconi's operations was evolving rapidly. He expanded his company into multiple subsidiaries, tailoring services to different markets. There were divisions dedicated to maritime communication, governmental services, and commercial broadcasting. Offices were opened in New York, Paris, and Buenos Aires, and negotiations took place with companies interested in integrating wireless technology into their global operations. For the first time, wireless communication began to be seen as an essential infrastructure rather than a luxury or experimental novelty. In the Americas, Marconi found a receptive audience. The vast distances between major cities and the challenge of connecting rural areas made wireless an appealing alternative to expensive and slow cable installations. Marconi's engineers worked with regional partners to erect long-range wireless stations throughout Canada and South America. These efforts helped disseminate the technology to new audiences and sparked local innovation, as technicians and engineers began to develop adaptations suited to their environments. To sustain and coordinate this international growth, Marconi relied on a tightly knit network of engineers, diplomats, and managers. He personally traveled often, attending openings, inspecting equipment, and meeting with political figures. His multilingual upbringing proved advantageous, allowing him to navigate the halls of power in Italy, Britain, and beyond. His charm, coupled with an unrelenting focus on his mission, earned him a reputation as both a visionary and a pragmatist, one capable of dreaming big while delivering concrete results. As the network matured, Marconi began exploring the use of wireless technology for peacetime, civilian communication beyond maritime and military uses. Experiments with point-to-point public messaging and early versions of wireless news broadcasts were conducted. Newspapers began to receive updates via wireless before physical dispatches arrived, and stock market figures could be shared across continents almost instantaneously. Though primitive by modern standards, these early uses hinted at the revolutionary possibilities of mass communication through the airwaves. As Europe edged closer to the precipice of war in the early 20th century, the strategic value of communication took on a new dimension. Governments, militaries, and intelligence agencies quickly recognized that wireless telegraphy was more than a technological marvel. It was a tactical asset. Guglielmo Marconi, whose global wireless network had already reshaped commerce and navigation, now found his work at the center of international defense planning. Wireless technology was poised to redefine not just how people communicated in peace, but how nations waged war. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Marconi's services and patents became deeply entwined with the efforts of the Allied powers. Military command structures were reorganized to integrate wireless stations as nodes in their strategic operations. Troop movements, naval logistics, and diplomatic correspondence all relied increasingly on electromagnetic transmissions. In a theater of conflict where speed could mean survival, the instantaneous nature of wireless communication became indispensable. Naval warfare, in particular, experienced a transformation. Gone were the days when ships relied solely on visual signals, flags, or limited-range wired communication. With wireless sets aboard battleships and cruisers, commanders could coordinate maneuvers across vast expanses of ocean, responding to threats or changing strategies with minimal delay. Marconi's earlier maritime work had laid the foundation, but wartime conditions pushed it to new levels of precision, robustness, and secrecy. However, the war also introduced new challenges for wireless communication. Signals could be intercepted, decoded, or jammed. This vulnerability gave rise to an entirely new field: wireless intelligence and counterintelligence. Enemy listening stations monitored transmissions, seeking to gather information or mislead opposing forces. As a result, Marconi and his engineers began collaborating with governments to develop techniques for signal encryption, frequency hopping, and directional antennas that would reduce the likelihood of interception. In addition to encryption efforts, the military use of wireless brought about rapid miniaturization and portability. Field units needed compact, durable transmitters that could function on the front lines. Marconi's laboratories worked intensively to adapt their equipment for battlefield use, devices that could be carried by soldiers or mounted on vehicles. These innovations not only served the immediate demands of war, but also foreshadowed the post-war evolution of radio into a mobile, personal technology. Wireless communication also revolutionized air warfare. Aircraft, a relatively new addition to the battlefield, required dependable communication with ground units and other planes. Marconi's radio sets were adapted for aviation use, enabling pilots to receive orders, transmit reconnaissance reports, and coordinate aerial operations. This integration of wireless into military aviation created a strategic synergy between two of the most transformative technologies of the 20th century. Beyond the front lines, Marconi himself served the Italian government in both a technical and diplomatic capacity. As a prominent national figure and senator, he advised on matters of defense infrastructure and signal coordination. He also undertook missions to discuss wireless strategy with allied nations, lending his expertise to strengthen cooperative efforts. Though no longer directly operating equipment himself, Marconi remained deeply engaged in the scientific and logistical challenges posed by wartime communication. The wartime atmosphere accelerated technological innovation. With state funding, urgency, and vast human resources at his disposal, Marconi's engineers made significant strides in signal clarity, distance, and reliability. Many of the wartime improvements would later be adapted for civilian use, including better tuning circuits, interference suppression, and the capacity to operate multiple transmissions without overlap. These wartime laboratories, born out of necessity, became incubators for the next wave of communication technology. The impact of wireless on public morale during the war was equally profound. News from the front, relayed by radio and then printed in newspapers, reached civilians faster than ever. Families clung to these reports, and although the broadcasts were not yet public in the modern sense, wireless telegraphy helped create a new rhythm of news and awareness. Marconi's system had begun to knit not just governments and armies together, but entire societies, shaping public consciousness with immediacy and reach. By the end of the war in 1918, wireless communication had evolved from a novel invention into a cornerstone of modern warfare. Marconi's vision, once questioned by skeptics, had proven not only viable but vital. The war had transformed the wireless from a peacetime utility into a battlefield imperative, and in doing so, had accelerated its development and solidified its place in the infrastructure of nations. For Marconi, the conflict had brought validation, but also a glimpse into the immense responsibility that came with wielding a technology capable of shaping the fate of millions. In the aftermath of the First World War, a new spirit of technological optimism swept across the world. Amid the ruins of conflict, societies sought ways to rebuild, reconnect, and reimagine their futures. Wireless technology, once confined to military dispatches and maritime coordination, began to take on a more public role. The airwaves, previously reserved for urgent signals and strategic commands, now offered something novel: the potential to carry voices, music, and news into people's homes. It was the dawn of broadcasting, and Guglielmo Marconi stood once again at the edge of transformation. The technical groundwork for broadcasting had been laid during wartime, but the leap from point-to-point communication to one-to-many transmissions required a shift in both equipment and philosophy. No longer was the goal limited to sending messages between two operators. Instead, radio became a medium of mass communication. Transmitters were redesigned to carry audio signals, while receivers were adapted for consumer use. The public's curiosity was piqued by the idea of hearing distant voices through the air, an idea that had once seemed magical. Marconi, ever attuned to both innovation and opportunity, quickly pivoted toward this new field. Through his company, he began funding research in amplitude modulation, AM, a key technique that allowed voice and music to be carried with clarity over long distances. His engineers experimented with microphone integration, signal amplification, and antenna design, all with the aim of refining the fidelity and range of broadcasts. These technical breakthroughs laid the foundation for the first experimental radio stations. In the early 1920s, these experiments began yielding tangible results. Trial broadcasts in Britain, Italy, and the United States demonstrated the viability of radio as a public service. Music concerts, election results, and even weather forecasts were transmitted to anyone with a receiving set. Marconi stations, some of which had previously served military or maritime purposes, were now repurposed or rebuilt to accommodate the broader spectrum and higher power requirements of public broadcasting. This period also witnessed the birth of organized radio networks. Marconi was instrumental in the formation of several national and private broadcasting entities, including the British Broadcasting Company, BBC, which initially utilized Marconi equipment and infrastructure. His vision of wireless as a public utility began to take form, albeit with a new focus. Information, culture, and entertainment became the lifeblood of the medium. What had once been a tool of war now carried symphonies, theater, and international news to everyday listeners. The impact on society was immediate and profound. Radio brought the world into the living room, collapsing geographic boundaries and introducing a shared cultural experience. In rural villages and urban centers alike, people gathered around receivers to listen to broadcasts that blended education, recreation, and national identity. For many, radio became a trusted companion and a window to the broader world, a role that printed newspapers had never fully achieved. This democratization of access to information resonated deeply with the ideals of the post-war era. Marconi's involvement extended beyond the technological. He understood that content, regulation, and commercial viability were critical to sustaining the broadcast revolution. He engaged with governments on the allocation of frequencies, helped establish licensing protocols, and consulted with advertisers and program directors. He advocated for balanced programming, one that combined public interest content with commercial sustainability. His strategic foresight allowed broadcasting to grow in an organized, scalable manner. Though the public often associated Marconi with the technical side of radio, his influence on its cultural trajectory was equally significant. He believed that wireless broadcasting could promote international understanding, provide education to the underserved, and elevate public discourse. In speeches delivered across Europe, he emphasized the social potential of the medium, urging its use not merely for profit, but for public enrichment. These views aligned closely with emerging concepts of radio as a civic institution. Technological innovation continued throughout the decade. Directional antennas improved signal targeting, while tube amplification enhanced sound clarity. Marconi's team also worked on shortwave broadcasting, which enabled transmissions to reach far-flung regions of the globe using high-frequency signals that bounced off the ionosphere. This allowed broadcasters to communicate across continents with greater efficiency and reliability, expanding the reach of messages from London to Africa, from Rome to Asia. By the late 1920s, Guglielmo Marconi had become a figure of global renown, a name synonymous with a mastery of invisible forces and the transformation of human communication. The scientific community, international institutions, and national governments alike showered him with accolades. His contributions were recognized not only as pivotal technological breakthroughs, but also as catalysts for a new global era. He was no longer viewed simply as an inventor, but as a statesman of science, a man whose work had bridged continents, cultures, and languages. Among the many honors bestowed upon him was the Nobel Prize in Physics, awarded in 1909, which he shared with German physicist Carl Ferdinand Braun. Though this recognition had come earlier in his career, it gained renewed attention as radio broadcasting surged in popularity. Marconi received honorary degrees from prestigious universities including Oxford, Bologna, and Cambridge. Scientific societies welcomed him as a fellow, and newspapers often featured him in glowing profiles that highlighted both his scientific brilliance and his diplomatic grace. But as with all pioneers, Marconi's path was not without its frictions. The rapid expansion of radio technology had attracted a multitude of new voices, scientists, engineers, and entrepreneurs eager to claim their stake in the electromagnetic spectrum. Figures such as Nikola Tesla, Reginald Fessenden, and Lita Forrest challenged both the novelty and the ownership of various components of Marconi systems. Legal battles over patents became more frequent and complex, often entangling inventors in years of courtroom drama. One of the most contentious rivalries was with Tesla, who asserted that Marconi had borrowed heavily from his patented oscillator technologies. While Tesla's contributions were indeed foundational to wireless theory, Marconi's commercial success and practical implementations had given him the advantage in public perception. The U.S. Patent Office, under pressure and amidst corporate lobbying, oscillated in its rulings. The legal debates, though technical in nature, raised broader questions about invention, recognition, and industrial power in the age of wireless. Marconi navigated these rivalries with characteristic poise. While he seldom responded to public criticism directly, he reinforced his leadership through continued innovation and strategic partnerships. His company expanded into new territories, aligning with governments and shipping lines that trusted his equipment and infrastructure. He also maintained a visible presence at scientific conferences, where he delivered lectures that emphasized collaboration, global standards, and the promise of peaceful uses of wireless communication. As broadcasting flourished, new competitors entered the scene, offering alternative technologies and visions for the future of communication. American firms like RCA, General Electric, and Westinghouse began dominating the domestic and international market. Their scale, access to capital, and political clout often outpaced the Marconi company's more focused operations. This shifting landscape forced Marconi to consider mergers and joint ventures, ultimately leading to a reorganization of his corporate interests and the creation of partnerships that would shape the telecommunications industry for decades. Despite these industrial realignments, Marconi's individual stature remained intact. Heads of state invited him to state functions and scientific summits. He was appointed president of the Accademia d'Italia and made a marquis by King Victor Emmanuel III, cementing his place in Italian nobility. His portrait hung in academies and laboratories, and streets across Europe and South America bore his name. Wherever wireless technology advanced, Marconi was cited as the progenitor. Yet even as he basked in honors, Marconi was acutely aware of the passage of time and the generational turnover within science. Younger inventors were emerging with new ideas, shifting attention toward television, radar, and early computing. Marconi admired their zeal, but remained cautiously skeptical of ideas he viewed as underdeveloped or overly speculative. He believed deeply in methodical experimentation and practical application, cautioning against the allure of technological utopianism. To maintain relevance in the scientific world, Marconi increasingly participated in advisory roles. He served on commissions related to communications infrastructure, military preparedness, and international radio regulation. He remained active in Italy's scientific policy development, often meeting with ministers and advising on technological investments. These roles allowed him to exert influence without needing to be on the cutting edge himself, an evolution befitting his new stature as elder statesman of wireless. In the final years of his life, Guglielmo Marconi withdrew gradually from the laboratory, shifting his focus from experimentation to introspection. Now in his 60s, he spent more time in quiet contemplation at his villas in Rome and along the Ligurian coast, where the sea, always his companion in the early days of wireless trials, continued to stir his imagination. The roar of waves, once a source of practical challenge to signal transmission, had become a metaphor for the unending flow of information that now coursed invisibly around the globe. Despite his retreat from active invention, Marconi remained intellectually engaged. He kept abreast of advances in electronics, particularly in shortwave radio and emerging research into wave propagation in the upper atmosphere. While he no longer oversaw daily operations at his company, he still attended scientific congresses, posed questions to young researchers, and encouraged transnational dialogue on wireless standards. These engagements gave him comfort that his life's work would not end with him, but would live on through others who shared his conviction in the power of electromagnetic science. Marconi's personal reflections during this period grew more philosophical. In correspondence and in interviews, he spoke increasingly about the moral implications of communication. He viewed wireless not merely as a tool for information exchange, but as a force with the potential to shape peace, diplomacy, and mutual understanding. He lamented the use of his technology for war, but remained hopeful that the same systems could be redirected to foster unity in a fragmented world. For Marconi, the ether carried not only signals, but also the fragile promise of human progress. As fascism rose in Italy, Marconi, though a supporter of the monarchy and national pride, found himself navigating a complex political landscape. He accepted ceremonial roles under Mussolini's regime, including leadership of the Accademia d'Italia, but kept a distance from direct political declarations. Scholars continue to debate the extent of his ideological sympathies, but what remains clear is that Marconi's identity was shaped more by scientific nationalism than by partisan dogma. He believed in elevating Italy's stature through innovation, not coercion. In the early 1930s, Marconi's health began to falter. Years of relentless travel, stress, and exposure to electromagnetic equipment had taken a toll on his body. Despite growing fatigue, he continued to make appearances at radio conventions and international conferences, often arriving in a sharply tailored suit, with his familiar air of quiet authority. He was not just an inventor, but a living emblem of a technological age whose heartbeat was transmitted through the air. On July 20th, 1937, Guglielmo Marconi died of a heart attack in Rome. The world paused to honor him. In a striking tribute, radio stations across several continents fell silent for 2 minutes. The silence was more than symbolic. It was a shared reverence for the man who had made silence optional in a previously disconnected world. The very medium he had pioneered was used to memorialize his absence, creating a powerful echo of his life's purpose. Following his death, Marconi's influence did not wane. Scientific institutes, engineering schools, and communication networks around the globe bore his name. His patents continued to be referenced in new innovations, from radar systems to satellite communication. Scholars wrote extensively about his contributions, debating their place alongside contemporaries, but none could dispute the breadth of his influence. Marconi had not only initiated a technological shift, he had transformed how civilization conceptualized distance, presence, and immediacy. His legacy was also preserved through his family, who safeguarded his archives and supported historical preservation efforts. Museums and memorials were erected, and UNESCO later named several of his sites and laboratories as part of the heritage of communication. His original instruments, coherers, transmitters, and antennas, were placed in glass cases, not as relics, but as artifacts of a revolution. Through them, students and visitors could glimpse the physical beginnings of a borderless world. More profoundly, the conceptual framework Marconi introduced, that messages could traverse great distances without wires, without intermediaries, in real time, became the foundation for the modern digital age. Every mobile phone call, every satellite broadcast, every Wi-Fi signal owes a conceptual debt to the experiments Marconi conducted on windswept hills and ship decks. His legacy is not confined to the past, but reverberates in every moment of modern connectivity. Guglielmo Marconi's life was a testament to vision, perseverance, and the courage to challenge the limits of what seemed possible. From his earliest days in the attic workshop to his global recognition as a scientific statesman, he held fast to a belief in invisible forces that could unite humanity. Though he is no longer present to tune the dials or adjust the circuits, his fingerprints remain on every transmission that arcs across the sky. His voice, though silent, continues to speak, carried by the very waves he first dared to harness.